Seems like the Orioles have finally filled up all of the major roles on their big league coaching staff for next year. We'll talk about the two newest additions coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, November 18th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about two new coaching hires that the Orioles made over the weekend as they have added Miguel Cairo, the veteran, and a younger coach in Joe Singley to their staff. We'll talk about what each guy brings to the Orioles in 2026 and beyond, and chat a bit about the 40-man roster protection deadline, which comes up later today. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Just download the FanDuel app today. So let's start with some coaching hires for the Orioles. It seems like after the two reported hires we saw over the weekend, the O's big league coaching staff around their first-year manager, Craig Albernaz, is pretty much set at the highest level, right? There's still some space to maybe hire some assistants. Like I think they'll probably hire at least one assistant hitting coach in the next couple of weeks or so. But otherwise, in terms of guys taking over the full different departments on the team, they seem to be pretty much good to go. So let's take a look at kind of who they brought in over the weekend. And that is starting with the veteran coach, Miguel Cairo, who the Orioles reportedly, in terms of, or according to Rock Kabako of Masson, reportedly hired Miguel Cairo as their infield coach over the weekend. Now, Cairo, who is 51 years old, has some managerial experience as well. He spent the final 72 games of this 2025 season as the interim manager for the Washington Nationals. The Nats went 29-43 with Cairo at the helm. He took over on July 7th after Dave Martinez, who had won the World Series with the Nats back in 2019, but things had gone very, very poorly basically since then. They fired Dave Martinez, and they promoted Cairo, who had been the bench coach. He was hired before the start of the 2024 season to be the Nationals bench coach under Martinez, and then got the elevated role once Martinez was fired. Now, initially, Cairo was in the running to be the Nationals' new full-time manager, but didn't get the job, was kind of pushed out even before he became a full finalist, it seemed like, and they hired 33-year-old Blake Butera, who was a coach and a manager in the Rays system, to get that Nats job, and Cairo was then sent to kind of look for coaching jobs somewhere else. Now, Cairo began his kind of coaching career, or at least his off-the-field baseball career, in 2013, right after he retired from the big leagues playing with the Reds. He was hired by the Reds to stay in the organization by then GM Walt Jocketty to be a special assistant to the GM in the Reds front office. And he stayed in that role for 5 seasons, from 2013 through 2017. Cairo got to see a lot of the things that happen in the front office. And I got to think that is a lot of what, kind of pulled the Orioles towards hiring Miguel Cairo here, is that, Mike Elias likes to have, and most modern front offices do like this, to have a couple of guys in dugout, in uniform on the big league staff who have some sort of front office experience. It just makes it a lot easier, that line of communication between the front office and the dugout, when there are people there in both spots who have done the other job, and that can certainly be helpful. Now, for Cairo, once he did that job, he actually spent a little bit of time as the Reds interim bench coach in 2013. Another one of their coaches was sick at one point, so he kind of did get both experiences. And then the Yankees hired him away in 2018 to be more of a coaching role. They hired him as their minor league infield coordinator, so he would kind of rove between all levels of the Yankees minor leagues, working with the infielders, and he stayed in that role for 3 years, from 2018 to 2020, before the White Sox hired him to a full-time major league coaching role. The White Sox hired Cairo in 2021 to be the major league bench coach after they had hired, for some reason, Tony La Russa to be their manager. And that allowed Cairo to get some kind of interim manager experience, because in September of 2022, Tony La Russa took a leave of absence from the White Sox for his health. He also was away from the teams a couple of times during the 2021 season and earlier in 22. So overall, Cairo was the interim manager for 33 games for the White Sox over that stretch. They went 18-15 when he was at the helm. And then we learned that La Russa was not going to come back after that 2022 season, citing health issues, although that entire 2 years was a disaster with him at the head of the White Sox. And Cairo did get an interview for the White Sox manager job, but did not get the role. It eventually went to Pedro Grifol, who then also got fired, and now they have Will Venable in that job. But Cairo did not stick with the White Sox once La Russa was gone. The Mets then hired him to get back into that minor league role as their minor league infield coordinator in 2023, but he only stayed there for 1 year because another big league team came calling, and the Nationals hired him in 2024 to be the bench coach, and that is where he was, including about half the season as interim manager last year with Washington before coming a coaching free agent. Now, Cairo has been around baseball for a long, long time. If you're a baseball head, this is a big time. Remember some guys, Miguel Cairo, who played 17 years in the big leagues from 1996 all the way to 2012 as an infielder, played for 9 teams, the Cardinals, Rays, Reds, Yankees, Cubs, Mariners, Mets, Phillies, and Blue Jays, but he never played with one team for more than 4 seasons. He really bounced around in those 17 years. Quite frankly, he was never really that good of a player. He accrued only 5.1 wins according to FanGraphs. He had a 2.4 WAR season in 1998 when he was like an elite infield defender, even though his bat was still below league average. And in only 4 of those 17 big league seasons did Cairo have a WRC plus of at least 100, basically meaning he was at least a league average major league hitter. Best 2 seasons was a 106 WRC plus in both 2001 when he split with the Cubs and Cardinals, and in 2010, kind of at the end of his career when he had a little resurgence with the Reds. He did hit 283 as a pinch hitter in his career. He was pretty good in that role. Also at age 37 in 2011, kind of his final full season with the Reds, he hit 379 as a pinch hitter that year. So good, like defensive infielder. And that definitely allowed him to stay in the big leagues for as long as he did, right? 17 years and you're not much of a hitter. You're probably going to stick around because of defense. And he's been able to turn that over to the next generation, kind of being mostly known as an infield coach. And that is the job the Orioles are hiring him to do on the big league staff. Now, seemingly been a well-respected player, was well-liked in that Nats organization, well-respected coach as well. He's really had to grind throughout his entire career. And you know, a lot of staffs will have their third base coach also be the infield coach. That is what Tony Mansolino did for the Orioles. That's what Bobby Dickerson did for the Orioles in the Buck Showalter era. But Miguel Cairo has never been a third base coach. And we did learn last week that the Orioles reportedly were going to keep Buck Britton on staff. Remember, Buck Britton served as the interim third base coach once Tony Mansolino moved from there to interim manager when Brandon Hyde was fired in May. And then we did learn, according to Andy Kuska of the Baltimore Banner on Monday, that Buck Britton's role will be third base coach for the 2026 season for the Orioles. So Cairo will be on staff. He will be coaching infielders, but he will not be a base coach. The base coaches will be Buck Britton at third and Jason Bourgeois at first, who was hired away from the White Sox this offseason. Now, for Cairo, like there's no obvious connections to either Craig Albernaz or Mike Elias when you kind of do some digging through his baseball career. But he's a veteran coach. He's done a lot of different jobs. He has the front office and the dugout and the minor league stuff all together. He's really kind of got the perfect resume for someone you would want as both a player and a coach on your big league coaching staff. So it seems like a really, really good hire for the Orioles to go and get Cairo and add him to this staff. So Cairo kind of becomes the veteran that is added to the staff. And then they also reportedly hired a much younger coach to add as well. We'll tell you who Joe Singley is. That's coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of the game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. And it keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So just head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So for the Orioles, they made reportedly not just one, but two coaching hires onto their major league staff this week. And Miguel Cairo comes in as the infield coach, and they've also hired Joe Singley to be the major league field coordinator and catching coach for the Orioles. That was reported by Andy Kuska on Saturday. Now, Singley was previously the catching coach for the Miami Marlins last season in 2025, while also serving as one of their bullpen catchers. Before that, spent 2 years as an assistant coach and catching coach and bullpen catcher for the Cincinnati Reds in 2023 and 24. Now, Singley is only 38 years old. 38 years old. He's older than 38. That is terrible math by your guy, Connor. But Singley is going to be one of the younger coaches on this staff. And he is going to, at the very least, kind of lead this catching tandem along with Craig Albertaz, who, of course, came from being a bullpen coach and a catching coach and a minor league catcher. And I think really does a lot to add to this staff. Now, the story of Joe Singley is a really, really interesting one. He was previously a standout high school prospect. He was a catcher at Archmere Academy, a private school in Delaware, kind of grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, so somewhat of a local kid is Singley. And he was committed to play college baseball at Tulane, a great Division I program, has produced a lot of talent, but then he got injured. Tore his labrum, separated his AC joint, had a hairline fracture in his collarbone, basically left him unable to throw when he got to Tulane, and throwing is a big part of being a catcher. So he transferred. He transferred to Indian River State College, which is a junior college, but still couldn't play. Had multiple shoulder surgeries after he got there that forced him to miss his first 2 college seasons in 2017 and 2018. But he was still a big-time catching prospect, and it seemed like he was healthier after the surgeries. So he was recruited by Coastal Carolina, another amazing program. Of course, made it to the College World Series finals here in 2025. And he was recruited to Coastal in 2019, despite still having not played a college game. And then he got to Coastal and he had 2 more shoulder surgeries while he was there. It became pretty clear that his shoulder was just not okay. So he ends up missing the 2019 season because of the shoulder surgeries. And then in October of 2019, tragedy hits him. Unfortunately, he loses his dad, Joe Singley Sr., to cancer. Joe Sr. was a minor league catcher, played professionally for the White Sox from 1987 to 1990. So that took him away from the team for a while. He took a semester off school at Coastal Carolina because of that, and then ended up being ruled academically ineligible for the start of the 2020 season. It seemed like he was healthy enough to maybe play, but then was not academically eligible. Now, that season, of course, was canceled in March due to COVID, but there still was about a month of the college baseball season before the cancellation, and he didn't get to play because he was ineligible. So the wait continued, and finally, with all the issues, all the injuries, he was going to be back at Coastal Carolina for 2021, but was instead named a student assistant coach for the Chanticleers. And this entire time, while he's unable to play because of injury, he started an Instagram account to talk about catching at catching_Singley on Instagram, has about 16,000 followers at this point. And that follower count included Reds catching coach at the time, J.R. House, Orioles legend, and Reds starting catcher Tyler Stevenson as well. They were watching his videos. They were like, this college kid is really good at teaching catching. And they told that to the Reds upper brass. And that was enough for 2 years later for the Reds to hire him in 2023 to not just be a bullpen catcher, but also be an assistant coach on their major league staff. And there's, again, none of those direct lines from him to Albertaz or Elias, but I can pretty much guarantee that Craig Albertaz knows who Singley is, and it's probably has met and spoken with Singley multiple times in the past through that kind of online catching coaching community. And he probably sought out going to get Singley to get him on his staff. Now, he's a fairly young coach, so it doesn't look like, at least at this point, he's going to also serve as the bullpen coach. The Orioles technically do have an opening at bullpen coach at this point. A lot of times your bullpen coach is also your catching coach, that we saw from Tim Cousins here in Baltimore before Cousins was fired, along with Brandon Hyde back in May. That's what Craig Albertaz did for the Giants for 4 years before getting hired by the Guardians. Now, last year when the O's made those changes, Mitch Plasmeyer went out to be the interim bullpen coach, We got reporting over the weekend that Plasmeyer will also be returning to the big league staff. He was kind of assistant pitching coach slash bullpen coach. There is a chance that maybe Plasmeyer remains full-time in that bullpen coaching role, and then they have Singley just kind of more so in the dugout and out in the bullpen, splitting time, working with catchers, working as a field coordinator, as another coach. Now, if you take a look at the Marlins, right, because he was kind of for the first time in charge of catchers with Miami last year, Marlins catching defense wasn't very good. They were 26th in fielding run value among catchers in the league. Now, some of that is because of Agustin Ramirez. Agustin Ramirez, the rookie catcher for the Marlins, was by far the worst defensive catcher in baseball last year. And I'm not going to put all that on Joe Singley, who had never worked with Ramirez in the minor leagues, only this 1 year in the majors. Ramirez's huge flaw, I mean, way worse than even what we talk about with Samuel Basallo, was his defense. He's got a really good bat. I mean, they're already talking about Ramirez just like never catching again and being a first base DH for the rest of his career. Like, that's how bad it was. But Singley worked with him, tried to get a little bit better, got him to at least the point where they could sometimes play him, and he did get him a lot better at framing, because the Marlins ended up 10th in framing. They were just last in throwing and last in blocking because Agustin Ramirez was so bad. Luckily for the Orioles, hey, Samuel Basallo, already a great thrower. Adley Rutschman, already an elite blocker, but both of those guys could get better at framing, and Singley made the Marlins a ton better at framing next year. Now, one thing to talk about is framing is going to start to go away a little bit. We know that the ABS challenge system is going to be implemented in 2026 in Major League Baseball, which means you can challenge certain balls and strikes throughout the game, and that will take away some of the value of framing. But most pitches are still going to be called by the home plate umpire and not challenged, and that still brings framing into the mix. Now, if a couple years down the road, we go to the full ABS, what they call a robo-ump system, framing's not really going to matter anymore. But for now, it's even with the ABS challenge system in place next year, it is still going to be a big factor because most pitches are not going to get challenged. And if you lose your challenges early, you're going to have a whole game where you need to steal some strikes still behind the plate. Framing's still going to be a big part of it. Singley seems to be really good at teaching that stuff to catchers as well. And I think this will be great because we know Craig Albernaz, the new Orioles manager, comes from that catching background, is great at teaching catching. But when you become the manager of a big league team, especially the first time he's ever been a manager in the major leagues, it is a different story, right? You can't just have the time to sit there every day with Adley Rutschman and Samuel Basallo and work on one-on-one catching drills. You need someone else in there. So while having Albernaz in this position is certainly going to help the catchers, it was also important for him to bring in someone as a catching coach who can do some of the similar teachings and have his full-time job be kind of working with those catchers. So I think the ability of Albernaz to now combine with Joe Singley, working with Adley, but even more importantly, probably working with Samuel Basallo, because we know he needs to improve his defense behind the plate if he wants to stick there, at least as a part-time defensive catcher long-term. This could be a huge plus for the Orioles on their coaching staff. But those were the two hires that the Orioles at least made to this point. Again, probably an assistant hitting coach, maybe another assistant coach coming on to staff. Really, the last guy we don't know the future of is John Mabry, who was hired to kind of add to the staff after Brandon Hyde was fired. I think that's the only guy we don't have reporting on for next year. He could stick around. He could not. Maybe there's another assistant hitting coach that comes in as well. Of course, we'll have all that covered. But one of those off-season deadlines is coming up later today, the deadline to protect players from the Rule 5 draft. We'll give a brief preview of that to finish off the show. That's coming up next. So this afternoon, and I've seen two different deadlines. I've seen someone say it's 4 p.m. Eastern, some say it's 6 p.m. Eastern. Either way, today, Tuesday, November 18th, is the deadline to add players to the 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. The way this works is generally about 4 years after you are drafted at a college or 5 years after you are drafted at a high school. If you are not yet in the big leagues and you are not yet on your team's 40-man roster, you are eligible to be selected in the Rule 5 draft. The Rule 5 draft allows other teams to pick minor league players out of another team's organization that have not been promoted to the big leagues. It basically stops teams from just hoarding guys in the minor leagues forever. We know the Orioles recently, their biggest splash has been getting Tyler Wells. They got him out of the Rule 5 draft. He's now become a really important part of their pitching staff over the past 2 years. Now, the Orioles haven't taken anyone in the Rule 5 draft over the last couple of years. They've lost a player here and there, Zach Pop, Juan Nunez, who was then returned from the Padres in last year's Rule 5 draft. But there are always important prospects who become eligible for the Rule 5 draft. And the way to make them ineligible is you just put them on the 40-man roster. Once they're on your 40-man, they no longer can be drafted in the Rule 5 draft, which happens at the end of the winter meetings in December. Now, the Orioles had a couple of guys I thought would be added, and one they already did. We already talked about it last week. Right-handed pitcher Anthony Nunez was already added to the 40-man earlier this offseason to be protected. There are a lot of other names in the Orioles system who are eligible. Really, for me, I think only one other player is going to be added, and that is 26-year-old right-handed reliever Cameron Foster. Foster came over to the Orioles along with Wellington Aracena in the Gregory Soto trade with the Mets at the deadline this year. O sent him straight to AAA as a reliever, and he was really good. 16 innings, 3.38 ERA, 23 strikeouts to just 8 walks and 1 home run. He had really strong swing and miss rates, really strong chase rates from AAA hitters against him. It's a four-seam fastball at 95. It's got, good riding action, good induced vertical break. He also has a cutter, curveball, and a slider that he throws that all have good swing and miss rates as well. I think there's enough stuff there that, he's already been in AAA. He's already 26 years old. He's someone who could easily pitch in the big leagues in 2026, has the stuff, has the experience. These are the kind of guys who have a good chance of being drafted by another team in the Rule 5 draft. And you combine that with the fact that Foster absolutely could help the Orioles out of the bullpen at some point in 2026. I think he's not 100%. I think Nunez was 100%. I think Foster's more like 60 to 75% likely to be added to the 40-man roster. The Orioles do have a full 40-man at the moment, so they'd have to make other moves. But, you kind of look at the 40-man, like Maverick Handley's on there. Ryan Noda's still on there. You got a couple of guys like George Soriano, like fairly easy to DFO those guys to make room for another arm. So I think the O's would be willing to do it. And guys who were going to be eligible, like Dylan Beavers and Samuel Basayo, they already got to the big leagues. They're already on the 40-man. You don't have to worry about them anymore. Now, there are some other options. I think someone like Cameron Weston is maybe 50-50 to be added, right? He led the Orioles organization through almost 140 innings in AAA as a starting pitcher this year. I think the stuff could go up as a nasty reliever. He is good starting pitching depth, but his numbers weren't that great, even though he ate a lot of innings in AAA. I don't know how much another team's going to want Cameron Weston. That one's 50-50 for me. Otherwise, there's, reliever Carter Baumler, who never even got to AAA. There's Keegan Gillies, former guest of the show, a reliever in AAA. There's Judd Fabian, an outfielder in AAA, who did have a really, really bad 2025 season. Those are all guys who I could see, along with Weston, being selected by another team. So maybe the O's would add them, but Fabian's bat, I think, still needs some work. I'm not sure he would stick with another team, because that's the other thing with the Rule 5 draft. It's not just you pick this guy out of another organization and then he's yours. No. There are stipulations to keep him. That player has to stay on your major league roster for the entirety of the following season for you to be able to keep him. So it's not just would a team want to put this guy on their 40-man roster. It's would another team be willing to select this guy and then guarantee him a roster spot if he's healthy for the entirety of the 2026 season. I don't know if Cameron Weston or Carter Baumler or Keegan Gillies have shown enough to deserve that. Judd Fabian would probably be the only one you could say, hey, he could be a fifth outfielder that just sticks on the end of somebody's bench all season. So maybe that makes the Orioles want to add him to the 40-man. That's possible. But I think his bat still has enough holes in it with the swing and miss that unless it's like a really just big time rebuilding team, like unless the Rockies just pick him and put him on the bench and let his power play in Coors, the Orioles could certainly lose someone like Fabian. The O's got Anthony Santander and Joey Rickard in previous Rule 5 drafts in that kind of same way. But the Rule 5 draft is a little different these days. There are less and less teams making selections in the Rule 5 draft every year for the past couple of years. I think a lot of it is because teams are just so much better now than they used to be at evaluating their own prospects, knowing who's good, knowing who's not. And opposing teams are good at evaluating other teams' prospects and knowing who's good and knowing who's not. So it's much less likely that a team would not protect a player who ends up being good just because his stats don't look great or something. Like there's not as many good players being left unprotected unless they have a tons of injury history that go out there. So that could be someone like Carter Baumler. Maybe he gets unprotected because he's just been so injured. Now that he's finally healthy, he's able to stick in someone's bullpen. But teams are just less likely to pick Rule 5 players. There's less good Rule 5 players out there. There's only like 15 or 20 picks made per year. So even if the Orioles don't protect any of these guys, like, would Judd Fabian be one of the 15 or 20 best players unprotected? Maybe not. He's not really anything close to like a top 100 prospect in baseball. Now, most of those top 100 guys are being selected, but you kind of get my point. Like, it's less likely guys are being taken, and the Orioles just have more talent on their own 40-man roster that they need to keep instead of giving spots to some of these guys. So I think it'll be Foster. I wouldn't be surprised if it's also Weston, and then I could see an argument for Baumler, Gillies, or Fabian being added. Otherwise, it'd be really surprising if anyone else did get a roster spot. But whoever does get added, it's even possible that Foster doesn't get added and the Orioles add no one. It's just like, yeah, Nunez was our guy. Everybody else go at it. So we'll see. But whoever does or does not get added, we'll talk about it on tomorrow's episode, along with, any other Orioles news and notes. I think we've got a minor league signing to talk about as well. But that's coming up tomorrow. Until then, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to follow the show, subscribe to the show wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you leave a 5-star rating or review, that really, really helps out the show as well. And if you have Orioles thoughts, you have feedback on the show, whatever it may be, you can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. That'll do it for today's episode. We are back tomorrow to talk about those Rule 5 protections. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.